When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Greg Kaloost. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. And welcome to this episode of Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century podcast. We're happy that you're here with us today, and we're very happy to have our guest who's joining us for a conversation today. His name is Jacob Kendall. He's going to tell you a little bit more about himself. I'm happy to say he's our first guest who is not oldish, but has a very special connection to oldishness and aging, and is, from what I've heard from talking with him, is definitely a passion and something he's studied and experienced and thought about. So, Jacob, do you want to take it over and tell the audience a little bit about you, and then the three of us will jump into a conversation?
Sure. Thank you very much, Janet and Greg, for the opportunity to join you on this episode of the podcast. So my name is Jacob Kendall. Just a little bit about my professional background. I have a master's degree is in social work and public health, focused a lot on international health and development. And I'm currently working on a Master of Divinity. I'm interested in ethical issues, end-of-life issues, faith deconstruction, things like that. And I also have a PhD in Interdisciplinary Aging Studies. That's a lot of syllables, so I just typically say that I'm a PhD in gerontology, and I consider myself a gerontologist. The interdisciplinary piece is really important. In the program, we learned about aging from the perspective of everything at the microscopic level, cells and genes, to chronic disease, neuroscience, psychology, and then to the very macro level, epidemiology, demography. And I was trained by a demographer, so I definitely tend to view aging and chronic disease and those issues from a very bird's eye view, macro perspective. And I taught, for a while, I thought that I wanted to do academia. I taught social work for a few years, and I taught global health. And a lot of my teaching was on dying and death, chronic disease, mental health, aging, population aging, and issues like that. And now I'm doing more, I've kind of moved into the entrepreneurial bug hit me. So, coaching and consulting and speaking, I want to take a lot of the things that I did in the classroom to other settings. I got to thinking, a lot of folks they need to hear some of this stuff, not just college students. So that's what I'm currently working on. And then personally, I have a family history of aortic valve disease. I've had my aortic valve replaced twice, but it's interesting because most people who've had their valve replaced are in older age. And so when I look at statistics of mortality and prognosis and things like that with valve disease, I have to remind myself a lot of these people who have had it are already in older age, so they're not going to have those longer spans there. And I just have to keep that in mind, because it can be a little bit like, oh my gosh, the survival with these is 10, 15, 20 years, but those people are already older. And it does obviously affect my own life expectancy. And so I'm 37, but I've had this all my whole life, and I've had to navigate our overly confusing healthcare system, and dealing with chronic disease and health insurance and whatnot. So I feel like not only do I am I trained extensively in gerontology, but I have my own issues, and I also have severe chronic back pain, and my own issues that I think help me to be able to relate to the very types of people that I enjoy interacting with, studying, etc. That being older adults. And finally, I should have said this earlier, in my PhD, I've focused on aging in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Malawi, a Southern African country. But there's not a whole lot of research on aging in Africa. And so I've had to draw on research from various parts of the world, East Asia, Europe, the US, of course. And so I do feel like my favorite thing to do is really think about comparing aging in different societies, different populations, different parts of the world. If there's anything else you want me to say in the part of my intro, feel free to ask. But that's kind of a summary of me.
Well, that's
well, you're
fascinating.
kind of like, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that you've been busy, clearly learning a lot in a wide-ranging kind of a way, even within a, if you want to consider gerontology to be a niche, it's a very wide-ranging study within that niche, and it's a niche that encompasses probably 90% of the people who have ever lived have bumped up against aging in one way or another. So that's you've got a lot of those bases covered. Of all the things that you mentioned, the thing that I want to ask you about most of all, not necessarily first, but most of all, I want to hear about aging other places. Our so far we've only talked to people in the States, and Jen and I have both traveled. So we've seen older people elsewhere, but we've seen different attitudes toward the elderly elsewhere. And I'm curious to hear about, is there oldishness in Malawi? I think was the first question that I had when I heard about your studies in Malawi. Is there oldishness there? So I don't want to, you don't necessarily have to talk about that first, but that's one thing I definitely want to hear before we go away.
Sure.
Well, and I'd also like to add, what as you've studied other cultures and around the world, what can we learn in this country from what you have seen all over the world? How can we be doing this better, or are we doing it the best? Which I already know the answer is probably no. But, what can we do here? So I just want to say that you bring so much to this conversation. So, whether we bring you back another time to talk about more, because there's so many directions we could go in here right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I meant to mention when I was discussing the unique aspect of the PhD program that I went through, unlike most doctorate programs that are in a particular discipline, they said instead of us learning how to master the techniques of a particular discipline, the most important thing that we're going to learn to do is bridge the gap between disciplines. And so that's just a natural way, I think, of how these different issues connect to one another. And of course, when you put that in global context, this is interesting. Really, really important questions to be asking. So I'm fine with go ahead and jumping into that question. There's a lot there to unpack, obviously. I'll mention a few different points. So I wasn't originally interested in studying aging. The thing that made me intrigued about this PhD program, it started Tulane University, where I did all of my previous graduate education in New Orleans. Started this interdisciplinary aging studies PhD program while I was in the master's program. And it was the interdisciplinary part that caught my eye. And I thought, well, if aging is something that encourages an interdisciplinary approach, and I'm an interdisciplinary person, maybe it's worth studying. And I was accepted for my social work practicum. I was accepted into a program in India. I knew I wanted to be in another country. And so I assumed going into that, like, it'd be great now when I know I'm interested in aging, it'd be good to request an internship a placement with an organization that serves older adults. So I can go ahead and start learning about what that's like if this is a route that I want to pursue. So this is the very beginning of my interest in aging. And I assumed going into it, like, well, India is a much younger population. They have a higher fertility. They're a lower income country than the U.S. I don't even know if aging is something you can focus on in a place like that. Boy, was I wrong. Aging is important everywhere. And I'm just acknowledging that. So with Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And they have a high disability and disease burden. If you can imagine, they're just, a lot of salmon and subsistence agriculture. So if they have a bad year with rains, that's a huge tilt in one direction there. Plus a lot of malaria, HIV, and if you just think about, living in tough conditions, I think 80% of the country is rural. It's a tough life, right? And research has found that they kind of age earlier. So I actually a lot of people like, whoa, that's crazy when I tell them the following, but I actually, in studying aging in Malawi, I studied everyone 45 and above. If I did 60 and above, I wouldn't capture everything that I need to capture because disability sets in a bit earlier on average there. Because it's just, again, it's high disease burden. But nonetheless, yeah, they have, like everywhere else, they're aging, they're getting older. And what we're seeing now in a lot of, I guess you could say the poorest countries in the world, lowest income countries, there's a lot of debate about whether we should call them underdeveloped, developing, low income. I'm not going to get into that debate. Just imagine, some of the poor countries in the world. Malawi, again, they're usually like consistently bottom 10, bottom 15. What we're now seeing is what's known as a double burden of disease. Here in the U.S., we think about heart disease, where a third of everyone dies of heart disease, and then cancer is number 2, dementia is quickly rising. All of these diseases are very, very tied to aging, right? HIV and malaria are on the opposite end of the age spectrum. It's mostly children and young adults being affected by those. So you have these countries, Malawi, South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe. A lot of them are affected, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, about what we refer to as a double burden of disease. So simultaneously, they still have malaria, cholera, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, but because they're aging, they're still going through the demographic transition. They also have an increasingly high burden of heart disease, cancer, and these other age-related conditions. We don't have that in the U.S. We don't have this dual burden of disease, right? And eventually these countries, they'll continue going through the epidemiological transition, and one day they're going to have much larger concerns with heart disease and cancer. And, we're doing people are doing some great things in those places to address malaria and HIV, but everything takes time. So right now they have this double burden of disease. And I think many Americans have a difficult time imagining what that can be like.
Absolutely.
So that's one part of it. Another thing, that's it. Feel free to stop me anytime to ask any questions or chime in. Another thing, I also studied household composition, and with older adults, we cannot, in sub-Saharan Africa, we cannot just talk about older adults being dependent. That doesn't make sense. I don't like that in the U.S. even. I don't think economically the older adults are considered dependents. That's how they're typically measured in all like the national economic measures. I don't even like that, because if we quantify the dollar value of grandparents babysitting grandchildren, it'd be in the billions of dollars. But nonetheless, older adults are typically treated as dependents from an economic perspective. And that makes even less sense in sub-Saharan Africa, because it's very common for grandchildren to live with grandparents. Let's say the parents left to go work in the city. They might leave their children behind to live with their grandparents in the village so that they can get more of a traditional education. And the parents will send money back from the cities. and just all kinds of various things. Plus, HIV/AIDS tends to take out the middle generation, so yes, fifth generation households, and it just doesn't make as much sense to just call older adults dependents because they're serving very valuable roles. It's also
I do have a question.
Oh yeah.
I do have a question. What does that mean for our country as far as, well, I guess the question is, because it is more recognized in those countries, those environments, that oldish people have a very important role. Does it show that they then have higher sense of self-esteem, higher sense of purpose? Is the view of being oldish and older in those countries different in the sense that everyone's just aware that, here's people in our family who are 50 and 55 and 60, and yes, we need them for this, as opposed to our country, which is why we have our podcast. It's kind of like, how can we think of ourselves as we get older, that's respecting ourselves, getting respect from others, feeling a sense of purpose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would have to rely mostly on my own visit to Malawi and more personal relationships, because aging in Africa is not nearly as well studied as it is anywhere else. I mean, it didn't take me that long, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, when I was working on the early stages of my dissertation, to read all the literature that had ever been written on aging in Africa. And the vast majority of it is on disability, health, and then there's another part of focusing mainly on ancestors and chiefs, but not just the everyday common older adults in the village. And so
Yes.
I really didn't have much to go on. I haven't read, I don't know if I can, I had to think through what I have read that talks about how they feel about, self-esteem and self-fulfillment and things like that. There's just not that much research on it. I can say from personal experience, having been there, that it is worthwhile to do studies on these things in Africa. We haven't gotten to that point yet. I'm currently working on a project that is related to religion among older adults, which is even less studied. When I first wrote that chapter, there were fewer than 5 studies that looked at the relationship between religion and health for older adults in the entire continent of 55 countries. Right.
Wow.
And now there's one more because I published one. But there are tons of those, like a very rich body of literature on that topic in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. There's just very little of that. But religion is very ubiquitous in a place like Malawi, and older adults are participatory with their congregations or whatever you call it, because Islam is about 15% there. So at the mosque or their church or whatever, older adults play roles. It's just there's been very little research done on it. If I did not answer your question, let me know.
No, well, a follow-up question would be, so I hear you that you're kind of like on the cutting edge here of what this all looks like globally, and whether it's religion, and I love the, thoughts of multidisciplinary approach to aging. What are your own thoughts, with all of the experience you've had, the study and, learning, speaking, what do you think as far as this country, like taking all of this, that is out there in the world and in our country, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll share a couple of observations that help provide the context to me answering your question about my own thoughts here. One, I've traveled extensively in Europe, Africa, and Asia over the past couple of decades, and a lot of those reasons, not all of them, but a lot of them are for some reason related to my work or research. And so I have the opportunity to share that I'm a gerontologist. And a very common thing I hear in other countries, virtually everywhere, a little bit less so in Europe, is that, Americans just stick their older adults in nursing homes, and that's just evil. Like, our families care for them here, but not in the U.S. less than 5% of older adults in the U.S. are at nursing homes. So I think that is probably a bit exaggerated in other places, but that's the perspective that they have of us. We should follow that and understand why that perspective exists.
Yeah.
The second point I'll mention is I'm going to start by using an example of what I've learned in my studies on religion and in seminary right now. The vast majority of scholarship in theology and biblical studies has come out of Europe, especially Germany and the US, largely ignoring African theologians, Southeast Asian theologians, Latin American theologians. But that's a problem because those parts of the world have more people and therefore more Christians. I'm sure this is very similar for Islam as well, but I don't know as much about that. And plus the growth rate of both Christianity and Islam are higher in these more developing countries or the global South. Again, a number of terms we could use. And so there's been a push more recently for the Western countries to not assume that they're the ones teaching Africa, for example, about Christianity. It should be the other way around. And I agree with that. And I think it's the same for aging and disease and chronic disease and these other experiences, because I'm just thinking here, right? Surely with all of the things that people in a country like Malawi have to deal with, wouldn't you think, wouldn't you think that older adults living in those places have some wisdom and insight to share about what it's like to age and go through life? That they have something to teach us, and it shouldn't be one way that these Westerners are going to go in there and say today for them. No, we need to be learning from them as well. So my opinion is that there needs to be much more of a mutual exchange of insight and wisdom. And I'm influenced by that because there is a push right now for that with theology and biblical studies. And I think that there should be a push like that for epidemiological, demographic, and cultural insights as well. Yeah,
yes.
I strongly feel that way. We need to stop thinking that we know everything.
Hear, hear. Amen.
Yeah, that's not going to happen soon. So
no.
One of the statistics that you mentioned, my experience of how do Americans treat the elderly is similar to what you described. I have this picture of warehousing. Nursing homes as warehouses, and one of the reasons that I have an interest in this is, one of my grandfathers died in a nursing home. You're mentioning the religious connection. The priest came to see him every day for as long as I knew him. The priest came and he had mass and he did all of that stuff. And he died miserably and horribly in a nursing home. And this was back in the 60s. And so, nursing homes and the medical model of how to take care of people was still kind of seriously rampant, and my last memories of him were he was all hooked up to tubes and wires and whatnot and was suffering and was trying to pull those out. So that actually wrecked my relationship with the Christian God that I grew up with, because it's like, wait a second, this is the most devout person I ever met. Still the case, the most devout person I ever met, and holy crap, the way that he died. So I obviously have carried that with me since I was 12 years old. So, but one other thing that popped into my head when I heard that 5% number is we have voluntary sequestration of older people here as well. So we've got the villages and gated retirement communities and mobile home parks where people technically are aging in place, but it's a weird place. I think I can say that. It's like they're not aging upstairs in their children's house. They're not aging in the living room taking care of the kids. They've moved away somewhere into a place where they're surrounded by other adults and they see their grandchildren when they travel to them. Now that's obviously is also overstated. So that might get you to 10%. But there's
Yeah.
I suspect that doesn't take place in what we think of as poorer countries as much because, a larger percentage of the people don't have the wherewithal to do that and better sense than to do that anyway.
Yeah.
As is true in this country too, as far as, what you're describing, especially the elder communities is for more wealthy Americans. So there's a large, percentage of people in this country who cannot afford that either. But I am curious about the 5% and what in this country, what is the rest of that, the 95%?
Yeah. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss. First of all, with the religious piece, you remember I told you I first started exploring my interest in aging when I was in India for 3 months. And India is an incredible natural experiment for all kinds of things, one being cultural and religious diversity. They have several different states, and some of them are predominantly Christian, such that you would actually call them, this is a Christian state, or this is a predominantly Muslim state, predominantly Hindu state. And so I doubt that this has changed. I've not looked it up in several years, but I doubt that it's changed. But when I was there, when I was reading about India, the nursing homes were more common in Christian states than they were in the other states. And the conclusion there is that it's largely a Western Christian convention. And that's really, really fascinating.
Yes.
About here in the U.S., what other options do we have? You are correct. Nursing homes are a very particular kind of formalized care. You have assisted living, you have memory care, you have daycare centers, you have continuing care retirement communities. You have aging in place. You have various types of home care. You have these different things. And on the one hand, it is accurate. If I'm interpreting what you were saying correctly, it is accurate to point out that although 95% of Americans are not living and older Americans are not living in nursing homes, that doesn't mean that they're in a desirable situation. However, the positive for me there is that we're coming up with a greater diversity of living arrangements, approaches to living. And that's just a part of the family and household transition anyway. That's not just happening with older adults. That's happening, period, where households are becoming more diverse. This whole thing about the traditional American household with two parents and the children, that's not traditional at all. That wasn't until the late 1800s, early 1900s. It wasn't that long ago in our own history where we lived in households that looked more like these places that we think are just so exotic. And I don't want to go back to those time periods with everything. I'm not suggesting that, but I just think it's important for Americans to realize that what they think is traditional is not really the correct word for that. I like the fact that households are becoming more diverse. And yeah, we haven't worked out how to do all these different retirement communities and aging in place communities perfectly yet. But the positive side of it is I like to see that people are coming up with some really cool ideas. And hopefully at some point, some of the better ones will really catch on, because you do occasionally hear about these super awesome aging in place communities. And, in their earlier days, they're very experimental. Let's try this out kind of thing. But hopefully the ones that are good, maybe those will catch on and spread. This is related to another idea that I learned about. The following often comes up when talking about disabilities. For example, ramps to get into all public buildings was started largely because of people with disabilities, but I'm a new father. Like, that's useful for people who have strollers as well. And all kinds of conventions that were invented. I think text messaging was invented to help out with people with disabilities. But now that's helpful for everyone. Honestly, when you envision a community that's friendly to older adults, safe sidewalks, good lighting, green spaces, being able to walk to the pharmacy and the bank and the gym and the library and these other places, who would not want to live in a community like that? So I know I'm being a little bit idealistic. I'm just trying to recognize I think there's space to see here, mental space to see that this diversification of ideas of living arrangements, including for older adults, if we're intentional about it, we can allow it to take us to a place that's beneficial for everyone. It sucks that we have to take so long and go through so many bad ideas, and we're not there yet. Yeah, I want to be very clear about that. So anyway, to sum up, I'm very, I do have some optimism about the diversification of ideas that we're seeing. Some of them are good. We're not where we need to be yet. I tend to believe that I'm a root causes kind of person. And so I'm looking for the root cause. I tend to personally believe that many, if not all, of the issues that we can point out here about how older adults are treated in healthcare, chronic disease, and dying and death, things that we really need to address. I think that any of those are, none of those issues exist in a vacuum. Like, let me think of how to say this. The issues that we have with how older adults age and deal with their health care is not an aging problem. It is fundamentally a healthcare problem. And we need to address all of healthcare. Otherwise, it's just going to be putting a Band-Aid on it. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to think about root causes. I mean, that's like, it could be like probably a whole book and,
Yes.
certainly
Yes.
more than one, podcast episode, because, when you said root cause, I was like, root cause. I mean, what would come up for me around root cause? And I think about, so healthcare, absolutely. And I also just think about, basic respect for one another and an assumption that every life has meaning. And also there's just this big piece for me about what you were saying about, I think Malawi, of why don't we as a culture assume that as people get older, they have more and more wisdom. Why is it that we don't look at, like, I notice that as people get older, we start to look more, the same. Our hair is all white, or we're bald, and anyway, we lose a lot of the individuality that we had as we were younger.
Yeah.
And then I think that, younger people tend to look at older people as they put everyone in this basket kind of, or this category, when really each person that looks is old, has so many stories to tell and so much to share. And, so the root cause is like, I don't know where that started, but, I feel like that's where I want us to get back to, is that people, anyone younger than oldish would look at oldish people like, oh, I wonder what they have to share. I wonder what their life was like. I wonder what amazing, like, I think about old people and look and think, that person might have been, rode a Harley Davidson. That person might have been, had 8 kids and can tell us all about, multitasking or, everything. But anyway,
I always
that's what happens
encourage
to
my
me.
students. I always encourage my students to try to have at least one non-family close friend who's 2 generations above you, like in your grandparents' age group. And it's good to be close to your family as well, but have someone
Yes.
that you're not obligated to see, right? Who you choose to have a relationship with. And I'm all about it. We need stronger intergenerational relationships and learning from one another. I agree with what you just said.
Yeah. I'm not saying that we're done yet, but when we do have a conversation with guests, one of the things we always ask them as oldish people is, what are some of your hopes and fears about being oldish? So I was thinking about maybe asking you, what are your hopes and fears for people who are older? So, and you've kind of answered that a little bit, but I'm just going to put it out there. Like, what are your hopes for just all of us, and especially this part of the lifespan, and your fears?
Yeah. One of my favorite questions, I love questions like the following, all kinds of things, not just about aging or about what's your favorite movie? If you could only visit one other place in the world, where would it be? No more traveling. So the following question is kind of in that line. One of my favorite questions to ask just older adults that I encounter, there's not as much point asking someone in their 20s or 30s because they haven't had as many, they don't have as large of a sample size. So one of my favorite questions to ask is, what was your favorite decade? And so I'm largely asking people who are in their 70s, and overwhelmingly, the answer was their 50s and even more so their 60s, their favorite decade of life. And so I don't know if someone else has done systematic research on this, but I would love for everyone else to know that that is such a consistent response, because there's so many people that love their 60s and you're not in your 60s yet. And clearly you have something to look forward to, right?
Yes. Great. I like that.
Yeah, I made reference to that recently in one of our podcasts, where one of the things that started me thinking about oldishness was I started hearing people say that. People who are older start saying, I'm having a great time. This is the best time of life. And I didn't believe it. It's not the least challenging time of life, that's for sure, but it's it's definitely, being older is definitely worth getting, it's worth the trip to get here, as far as I can tell. But that's talking as from a person who comes from a place of privilege. And I don't know if I'd be saying that if I were sitting in the corner of a nursing home somewhere because there was nobody to take care of me.
Well, I mean, I agree with that. And we don't want to dismiss folks who are having challenging experiences. And I'm not suggesting that we do. There needs to be enough space in our conversation to see kind of both sides, right? But it still is a fact of the matter that the majority of older adults are happy and healthy and have fulfilling, productive lives. The tendency for the human mind, and I would argue even more so for the American mind, is to exaggerate the negative. Polio is a good example. Whenever that was really popular, there was a race for the vaccine for polio, and I think it was the 50s. So many American parents who had children were so just like obsessed with that. It really affected a very small percentage of children, right? Same thing with terrorism after 9/11. I'm not saying these are not important issues, but less than 0.05% of people died of terrorism. The attention that we pay to things is often overblown, based on how it actually affects people. And I think that it's the same thing with aging. We had this in our mindset that, all older people are just decrepit and forgetting things and losing things and sad and depressed and unhealthy. And we fear that because of that, but that's not the experience of most older adults. And it doesn't have to be, and it's not right now. And there are things we can do they aren't that hard, for that to be the reality for most people. So I want to make it very clear here. All of the issues are important. Okay. Even the ones that affect a small percentage of people. I'm not saying that they're not important, but I think that we owe it to ourselves to know the epidemiological and demographic quantitative information behind these trends. I'm betting that most Americans would guess that somewhere between 10 and 50% of older adults live in nursing homes. I'm guessing that they would way over exaggerate that percentage.
Yeah, I agree.
If that's the case, then we owe it to ourselves to have an accurate understanding of reality, because that's the only way that we're going to, I think that's also necessary for solving the problems, right? So I don't want to get too preachy, but we have a tendency to think things, to think that negative numbers are higher than they are.
Yeah. You can preach all you want. I'm there with you. And just to wind down, I wanted to say two things. One, as a psychologist, that when I was studying, and I wasn't oldish yet, and I remember reading statistics from research about, I love thinking about identity development and developmental stages. And I remember reading about that there was, majority of people as they aged that kind of resolved a lot of the things that were kind of agitating to them in their lives and became more content and content as they age. And I remember thinking, is that true? It was like, it was such an unusual idea to me as a younger person. But now as I'm in this oldish phase, I see in myself and others. Yeah, I don't know what else I was going to say because I'm oldish and I forgot. But I think that, I was going to say when you said about, that we tend to, around all these issues, tend to have look at the negative and we, make that so out of proportion. And then again, as a psychologist, just thinking about that, such a essential knowing for ourselves as human beings is to watch out for, expanding the negative in our minds and our perspective and being able to see what there is to be grateful for. And so it's an important life lesson and important as we think about aging.
I wonder about the role of media and all of that you've been talking about, the thinking in the negative. So much of what we commonly think we know is produced, if not produced, reinforced by commercial media that, the television, radio, and so on and so forth. The advertising that's on there is around, in our politics, they're around generating negative impressions and then producing a solution. So, the people who believe that something is wrong are more likely to pay for a fix than people who don't believe something is wrong. So there's that. I wonder in places, I have no idea what the culture is like in Malawi, but I have traveled in India and I spent a fair amount of time in Nepal, and their cultures are not dominated by the commercial media. They have them, they have radio, they have television, they have movies and all of that, but their culture doesn't seem to be dominated by that. And there is, and also their family structures haven't blown up as much, which, sometime when we got nothing better to do than speculate, I have ideas on why the family structure got blown up back 100 plus years ago. But it seems to me that they may be more in the reality of the present. And, grandma lives down the hall and she's fine. And, people get old and that's fine. That's part of the deal. Whereas we are led to believe by our media that getting old is bad and it can be fixed. As long as you're willing to put up with the side effects of the fix. So that's all I have to say. That's all I have to say about that for now.
Yeah, I don't. The media is only reporting on what people want to hear. We don't care about positive news, and we don't care about the main killers. Heart disease isn't going to get the news. That's everyone knows about that, right? Acts of violence, natural disasters, things that kill relatively few people, are going to get much more news. And so the media is going to report on whatever is going to get views. I don't blame them. I agree with you that that's a factor. I think people in general have a tendency to just blame the media, but they're just, they're doing what people are going to listen to. I wish that the average person cared more about heart disease. Why does something that kills 1/3 of every human alive right now not getting much more attention? Why is that not a sexy topic? And we devote far more resources to things that affect fewer people. And I hope I'm not coming across as crass. I'm just giving you the numbers. 1/3 of everyone alive right now is going to die of heart disease, but no one gives a damn about that.
I do. Well, We have spent a lot of time together, and it's been extremely enjoyable and interesting and thought-provoking. And keep on keeping on, Jacob. You're doing really important work, and I hope that you will continue to have a voice and that voice will grow in your work. Thank you for joining us so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming
thanks for
on
the
with us,
opportunity.
Jacob. This has been great.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks very much for engaging with me. And this is very interesting. And y'all are doing great work as well. Keep it up.
No, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Jacob Kendall for bringing us his important viewpoint on some big questions. You can leave comments on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Our next episode next week will be our first anniversary episode. Janet and I will take a look back and a look forward as we head into our second year. Please join us. It will always be true that the most fun I ever had playing pickleball was just us hitting the ball back and forth and laughing on the little court next to the library with the river flowing by and the eagles wheeling overhead.